Greetings, comrades. Got another addendum here. Now there's one at the end of the show and the beginning of the show. But I just wanted to really quickly say I just came back home, and it seems increasingly likely that the United States will join Israel in attacking Iran. In fact, by the time you guys see this video, it may be all but confirmed. So buckle up, everyone. We are heading into the Middle East once again. Greetings, comrades, and welcome back to another episode of the Comrade Cast. And I want to assure you guys not to worry.
I'm awake. I'm awake.
Yes, it has been a little while, and I do apologize for that. And I will give you a little bit of insight as to what's going on in my life right now. As some of you may know, because I've talked to some people about this, I have embarked upon the journey of entrepreneurship and decided to start my own business. I'm not going to go too much into that right now. Obviously, this and any type of professional business, blah, 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 blah. It's all separate. It's all completely not to do with one another. But I have decided to take this journey on for a number of reasons. And I'm sure some people might be wondering what the hell, is a communist doing running a business. But here's the thing, guys. We do live in a capitalist world. And in a capitalist world, money is like oxygen, and you cannot survive without it. And after studying the game of capitalism for many years, I've come to the conclusion that the only way to really win it is to start a business. So there's that aspect to it, and there are a couple of other aspects to it. One thing, for example, is that I want to leave something that my kids can engage with, because the way I see it, the regular kind of 9 to 5 job, it's dying out. It's ending. Now it's very hard to break into the job market under the best of circumstances. And I see this only getting worse as time goes on. So if I want to prepare my kids for the future, I feel like I have to give them something that they can actually take advantage of. And then another thing is that all of the people who are spending money in politics are not forwarding my values. And if I want to see my values get forwarded, I have to have a little bit of money that I can play around with and actually use. So that's the gist of why I've embarked on this. And through the month of May, it was extremely busy. I was hustling pretty much every day, and I'm working longer hours than I used to, but it's so much more fulfilling to have the knowledge that not only are you working for yourself and not someone else, but even though you're working more hours, you have the freedom to schedule those hours. I, for example, am not a morning person, but I get most of my work done in the afternoon, and being able to schedule my work life around that makes everything so much easier and so much more fulfilling. Yeah, the reason why I haven't been around
Work.
and I don't know why those little peons, they always fucking get me. They always got me back in the day too. But anyway, that's the gist of it. I don't want to put my main channel off forever. And there's like a lot going on right now. There's like a lot going on in the world. And it's time to have a check-in. It's time to have a checkup. The last checkup we really had was during the Canadian election. And I pretty much called it 100%. I said that we're definitely going to have a liberal minority, maybe a majority. And at the end of the day, that's exactly what ended up happening. And I got a lot of comments from conservatives during the election. They would be like, no way, man. Pierre's got this in the bag. He's 100% going to be the next prime minister. You're crazy for suggesting anything otherwise. But none of those guys came back and apologized for any of that crap. Really fascinating there that they talk a big game, but at the end of the day, when they were obviously wrong, there's zero acknowledgement of that fact. So I just want to take my little victory lap there by saying, fuck you guys, I was right and you were wrong. But originally, I was going to make this episode about what's happening in Los Angeles. But as much as I want to talk about what's going on in LA, as we have Trump going full...
What are they, protesters?
And unfortunately, it just pales in comparison to what is happening between Israel and Iran, because this can escalate very quickly. And we are playing a very dangerous game right now. The last time I talked about this, they pulled down the entire podcast. So playing with fire here, I'm going to try and avoid that by not going into wild speculation like I did in the last episode. Try and keep things to the facts in discussing what we know and based on what we know, where things are likely to go into the future. And there is a ton of uncertainty. There's no way of knowing where the chips are going to fall, but I'm going to try and parse through them as much as I can by going with the facts that we have. So let's start on Friday. This is from the Institute for the Study of War, and they give us a pretty good outline of what happened. And basically, we have a first strike coming from Israel against Iran. Iran has not directly attacked Israel. I've heard a lot of like mental gymnastics around them using their proxies to attack Israel. But at the end of the day, Iran has not directly attacked Israel. As far as I'm concerned, this is a completely unwarranted first strike against a country. And I think we definitely need to take that into consideration. This is basically on the same level as what Russia did to Ukraine, a completely unprovoked first strike. Yes, of course, these two are moving pieces around the geopolitical chessboard, but this is the time in which this Cold War has really gone hot. And these strikes were very precisely targeted, even though Israel has very strong precision capabilities. You still can't be 100% completely precise. But there's going to be civilians and there's going to be women and children who died in these attacks. And ultimately, that's what happened. We did see civilian casualties, even though there was a pretty high degree of precision here. But at the end of the day, when you have civilian casualties, that is going to rally the population around the government. One thing, if you've been studying history for long enough, one thing you'll notice is that strategic bombing pretty much never works in terms of getting a country to capitulate on its own. Strategic bombing is something which can help get them there, but you need to have other aspects going on in the war, predominantly something like a ground invasion or the real threat of a ground invasion. For example, people might say that strategic bombing forced Japan to leave the war in World War II, but I don't think that just strategic bombing alone could have capitulated them. It was the fact that the Americans had a massive invasion force ready to go in case that this didn't work out, was working in tandem with that fact. So ultimately, strategic bombing in and of itself never works to capitulate a population. In fact, and what you most often see is the population rallying around the flag, rallying around the government, and basically saying, go there and get them, boys. But these strikes were really targeted against Iranian military officials, particularly the Iranian Revolutionary Guard Corps. I got a little graphic here showing the damage that has been done to the top of Iran's military structure. We still see we have the supreme leader still alive, although they've been threatening that they're going to come and kill him. But basically, his top staff in virtually every single position has been eliminated. And then, of course, we have other smaller staffers also being eliminated. And at the end of the day, this was a pretty powerful strike to not only decapitate much of the Iranian military, but also to decapitate much of the Iranian air defenses that exist. And right now, as we are speaking, Israel doesn't just have aerial superiority over Iran. They have the next level up, which is aerial supremacy, meaning that effectively the enemy air force can't do anything. Israel has 100% command of Iranian skies right now. In fact, they're even refueling their planes over Iranian skies, which is basically a troll. Like that's basically like a troll move. And Iran does not look like they are in a position to very effectively retaliate. Moving here, we can see some of the targeted strikes against the Iranian military members in Tehran. Of course, this is Iran's capital city. And to have your capital city so vulnerable right now, I imagine would be a very terrifying thing for most Iranians, that basically your armed forces are completely incapable of defending themselves and defending you. And yeah, it's not a good position to be in. And on top of attacking these generals, we've seen a lot of these attacks conducted against military installations, particularly any type of area where you can fire ballistic missiles out of, or their air defense systems. But we've also seen a lot of attacks on nuclear sites. And we have a couple of pictures here. This is from the Esfahan military site. We can see a couple of pictures of where damage was done. This one is from Natanz, another nuclear site where we can see damage done. And that was another major target for Israel's strikes, was against Iranian nuclear scientists. I saw a comment, it was like, man, it would be really insulting to be a surviving Iranian nuclear scientist right now, because that's basically Israel saying, like, you're not worth the time, you're not worth the effort, you're basically like C tier type of scientist. And this has been this has been Israel's spoken reason as to why they are conducting these attacks, is because Iran is just on the threshold of getting a nuclear weapon. And listen, guys, if you're like me, I've been following current events my entire adult life, and I've heard this refrain for decades now. I always hear that Iran is 2 years away from getting a nuclear weapon, but every time 2 years passes from that statement, it never ever happens. Israel's kind of like the country that cried nuke. At this point, it's hard to take them seriously in regards to their assessment that Iran is very close to a nuclear weapon. We look at a country like North Korea that has significantly less resources, significantly less population, significantly more sanctions against them, and yet somehow even they were able to create a nuclear program. It really begs the question, does Iran even have the capability to create a nuclear program? And I definitely think that question is very much so up in the air. I want to give you guys a little bit of a blast from the past. This is from a speech at the UN in 2018. Do you guys remember this? Netanyahu stood up in front of the UN and he had this like cartoon bomb, basically. And at the time, this is basically what he said. Iran is 1 to 2 years away from making a nuclear weapon. They're at this red line. We've got to go in and get them. And yeah, this is now almost 10 years in the past, and still there is no nuclear weapon from Iran. But I'll tell you guys one thing. If I were Iran, though, and I were in the position of their leadership, I would 100% want a nuclear weapon, because when you look at something like what's happening in Ukraine, Ukraine ends up giving up their nuclear weapons at the dissolution of the Soviet Union, and there's a lot of question of whether or not they could have kept and maintained those anyway. But even if you just keep them and you, for example, over time, find ways to reconfigure them into your own independent system, that is still a huge deterrent. And we talk about North Korea. We just talked about North Korea. There is a reason that country hasn't been invaded and overturned. It's because they do have a nuclear deterrent. And looking at all of these factors, I would, as an Iranian leader in a position of leadership, say, you know what, we got to have nuclear weapons. And what's really unfortunate is in the modern age, we are seeing the case for non-proliferation basically completely dissolve. And that's not necessarily anybody's direct fault, but I'm sure that there are plenty of countries looking around saying, like, man, if I want to secure my own independence, I would want a nuclear weapon. And then we're not just talking about rogue states on the periphery like Iran, like North Korea. For example, if I were Japan, I would be seriously considering getting a nuclear weapon to deter China. And if I were Korea, I would be seriously, South Korea that is, seriously considering getting a nuclear weapon to deter North Korea, China, and maybe potentially some sort of militarily resurgent Japan in the future. As much as we don't want more nuclear weapons in the world, we've created the geopolitical calculus that any country that's serious about its own self-defense and self-determination is highly incentivized to get a nuclear weapon. But the one thing for Israel is that yes, they can do a lot of damage. Yes, they have disabled a ton of Iranian air defense systems and even ballistic missile sites. And we're going to look at a map which looks at what's happening right now in a lot more detail. But as of recording, probably the majority, if not the outright majority, of Iranian ballistic missile systems have been disabled. Here's the thing about a conflict like this. I'm not going to believe what comes out from any country, because both countries have a ton of incentive to lie. For example, shortly after the strikes against Iran, Iran came out and said that they had shot down, I believe it was 2 or 3 F-35 fighter jets, and they had used clearly AI generated images to back up their claims. So it's like, yeah, okay, dude, almost certainly not. And today, Israel came out and said that they had eliminated something like it was either 3/4 or 2/3 of all of Iran's ballistic missile capabilities. Again, I'm not going to believe them. I'm sure they have disabled a ton of them, though, because they are actually releasing footage which is a lot more verifiable than the Iranian side. But I'm not going to say that, yes, take them at their word for it. You don't want to take any country at their word for what they're saying in wartime, that's for sure. But right now we have the Fordo nuclear facility in front of us. And this is the nuclear facility which is heavily embedded underground. And with the capability that Israel has, they cannot disable this facility outright because it's in such a fortified area, because, like I said, it's underground. Their munitions do not have the capability to destroy it and disable it. However, American munitions could. For example, a lot of their bunker buster bombs would have the capability of actually striking deep underneath the surface and potentially destroying this facility, if not damaging it very heavily. But yeah, Israel is going to need America's help on that one. And there is obviously a lot of geopolitical considerations as to whether or not, if America is going to strike Iran directly. Right now, we do have American warships intercepting Iranian drones and munitions on behalf of Israel, but that's a very different thing from we are directly striking your territory. And one of the things I have been seeing in a lot of right-wing circles right now is many people who voted for Trump and supported Trump are saying, do not go to war with Iran. We supported you because you sold yourself as the peace president. I would say that's not exactly going well. But regardless, you sold yourself on this platform of American isolationism. We're not going to get entangled in all these foreign wars. But here's this big obvious one that really doesn't concern us at all. Don't you dare go over and get involved in it. And it'll be interesting to see how that ends up panning out in the future. But at least you have this kind of pushback, because the pushback against America getting involved in Iran is going to come now, both from a right-wing perspective and, of course, from a left-wing perspective. So there's going to be some serious calculations to be had there. But if Israel can drag America into this war, it vastly changes the calculation. So we're going to look at the live map here, and we can see just 6 minutes ago that the Mer News Agency is citing security sources that they shot down 3 small drones that were attempting to target the South Paris field in southwestern Iran. That is another target which wasn't initially on the table for Israel, but now they are starting to move in and target oil and gas production facilities. But for example, yeah, we see that things are happening right now in real time, and we can see where some of these strikes have come in. One thing that I did want to draw your attention to, this is from 10 hours ago. This is from the UK MTO, that's the United Kingdom Marine Trading Organization. They say that they have received multiple reports of increasing electronic interference within the waters of the Gulf and the Straits of Hormuz. UK MTO says the level's intensity inside the Gulf have a significant impact on vessels' positional reporting through automated systems. So fascinating there. They're basically saying that someone is messing with the tracking systems. This is not like, at least as far as we know, not yet, someone trying to potentially shut down these ships or disable them through some sort of electronic means. But it looks like that they might be trying to mess with the tracking systems. And there's a couple reasons why someone would want to do this. My thinking initially is that you might want to protect your ships, right, from being struck by something, because if you mask their location through some sort of electronic means, through electronic interference, it can obviously be much more difficult to actually hit them as they're going through. And I want to war game this a little bit and see what Iran's responses are. I got to be real with you guys that right now, Israel has made Iran look like a total bitch so far in how the opening salvos of this war have and maybe not necessarily full-blown war, but looks like we're going to go to some sort of protracted warfare, because now we're in, I believe it's day 4 of missiles and munitions being thrown back and forth. So it's looking pretty grim that this is going to end anytime soon. And as the days increase, the likelihood of a quick resolution coming forward decreases. But as I was saying, Israel has really made Iran look like a total bitch. Like I mentioned, they have total air supremacy. They're striking a ton of their missiles and air defense systems. What's this, for example? Okay, there are some still involved, but this is, again, Iranian media. They have intercepted targets 2 hours ago, 21 hours ago. Okay, this is Israeli, a military spokesman saying we're carrying out raids in this area. And there we go. These bombs are like direct hits, right? This is 12 hours ago, airstrikes hit Kermeshan. And we've got another one over here. This is 6 hours ago. Israeli missile hits the highway linking Tehran and Qom, putting it out of service. So, yeah, there's a strike even against infrastructure here. And if we move over to the Israeli side, we see, quite frankly, a lot less strikes. We have a rocket fell near Safad. What's this one? This one says, a home front command following the detection of launches towards Israel. This is an alert being activated. This is not missiles actually hitting the ground. I'm assuming this is, more interceptions here. And we see a lot of markers of these Shahed drones coming in. And the thing about these drones is that these are probably, like, right now, Iran's most cost-effective method of hitting Israel, because they're cheap, they can do a lot of damage, but they have a ton of drawbacks. Let me show you guys right here real quick that this is the Shahed 136, and this was really first used by Russia, really test piloted by Russia. And according to Wikipedia here, the range for domestic production is between $10,000 and $5,000. That's very cost effective, because a lot of these more precise interceptions and missiles can cost hundreds of thousands of dollars, and in some cases even like upwards of $1 million. One thing to be very cognizant of is they have a huge operational range, 2,500 kilometers. That's easily more than enough to strike Israel from Iran. But the thing here is they're incredibly slow speed, and they're also very loud. They can only travel around 185 kilometers an hour, 115 miles per hour. A car can travel faster than that. Most of the time, you have a speed limit that limits you below that threshold. A car can easily travel that quickly if it needed to. And another thing about these drones is, because they are a pretty vulnerable target, a guy standing on his roof with an assault rifle, if he's got good enough aim, can basically take these down. So you don't need sophisticated systems to stop these. The way these work is through mass waves. You need tons and tons of these to be pushed through in order to actually hit anything successfully. And that right now is their best means of fighting back. The issue for Iran when it comes to using their ballistic missile systems is because Israel has such coverage of the airspace right now. They can detect where these missiles are being launched from. And even one of the advantages that you would have if you have a bunch of mobile platforms like Iran does, or maybe did, you can shoot off a missile and move your battery to somewhere else and then shoot off another one. But because right now Israel has such supremacy over the skies, they can see what's going on, and they can basically view these platforms being moved about and move to counter them. So right now, Iran is very limited in what it can do to Israel, and Israel is looking in a significantly more dominant position. And I'll tell you guys where my biases are right now. My natural inclination is to want to root for a country like Israel over Iran, because Iran is a theocratic dictatorship. But it's I will say it's impossible for me to root for Israel right now when you have Netanyahu and his cabinet of genocidal freaks running the country. So until there's some sort of government change, right, I'm not rooting for anybody. But let's talk about some of the best case scenarios for Israel right now. The best case scenario for them, as things stand, would be to force some sort of regime change in Iran And this could be a very double-edged sword. I put myself in the position of an Iranian citizen. I would be extremely upset with how inept my government looks right now. They look like they can't defend us. It looks like they have been spending their time and money on all sorts of frivolous things while you're just sitting there.
I have some shoes.
And it just looks like this government has been almost a disaster, like a complete disaster, and has done really nothing for you. As I mentioned before, though, having strikes that end up in civilian collateral damage can actually end up strengthening the government, where you have this rally around the flag effect. But you could force a regime change. It is definitely possible because I see the Ayatollah as pretty weak right now. But the thing is, as I mentioned, it could be a double-edged sword because I read this fascinating article, and I should have saved it for you guys, that basically was comparing the feeling of the Iranian top generals to what the Japanese generals were like at the start of World War II, where they look at the emperor of Japan as like a little pussy, and he's like holding back the country from really going balls to the walls and doing everything it needs to do. And right now, the feeling exists in Iran. So if, for example, you're able to overtake the Ayatollah and you're able to have hardliner military figures come in and start running the government, you could get the opposite effect, that rather than getting a government which is much more amenable to Israel and much more willing to work on a collaborative basis, you could end up replacing it with a bunch of hardliners who looked at this situation and thought, holy crap, we really got caught with our pants down here. We got to get our shit in gear. We got to expedite the process of getting a nuclear missile, because one of the things is that the Ayatollah has publicly said, we don't need a nuclear missile. We don't want a nuclear missile because this is against Islamic values of peace and blah, 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 blah. Whether you take him at face value, it's a big question mark. But effectively, what could happen is you have these military hardliners who look at this disaster and say, fuck you, you guys are dropping the ball. So we're going to come in and we're going to take over, and we are going to take off all the blinders and do everything that we need to in order to get this weapon and defeat Israel. That's a real possibility. The best case scenario is you have a much more liberal type of revolution in Iran where they overthrow the Ayatollah, and you have, again, like a government which is much more willing to work with them and much more willing to be a collaborative. Because the thing that Israel, while it does have a lot of advantages right now, it cannot actually invade Iran. Like, it can't take over the country, and it can't directly topple the government without some sort of external force giving it the means to do that, whether that could be the population itself or a larger country like America. Israel doesn't have the capacity to do that on its own. So I think that there is definitely hope from the Israeli side that there is enough pressure that you force a new government and you force a change in government. But again, that might not go the way that you want it to. And I think that there is also, from the opposite end, a hope that Iran can take out Netanyahu. I do think that Netanyahu is doing this as part of securing his own power. The guy has used any kind of political crisis that he can throughout his lengthy career to survive. And he will do what it takes, whatever it takes, to stay in power. And I think that this is definitely a next step in him making sure that, because things in Gaza seem to be winding down, it's like, what's there left for them to blow up? Not much. So they need to move to the next crisis in order to secure his position, in order to secure this wartime power that he's accumulated. And I think that there's a hope, again, from the Iranian side, that if they were able to muster up enough of an attack and enough pressure on Israel to force Netanyahu to be removed, then potentially they can come back to the negotiating table and come to some sort of ceasefire. But as long as Netanyahu's in power, I don't think that a ceasefire is looking very likely. But let's talk about one of the ways that Iran may try and put pressure on Israel and try and force them to come to a negotiated settlement, or to have his government or population overthrow Netanyahu, because there could definitely be a backfiring amongst the Israeli population where they say, we didn't want this. We didn't ask for you to do this. This was an unprovoked strike that you went ahead and did without any of our consent. Fuck you, Netanyahu, to the dustbin of history with you. That's a possibility, for sure. But one way that Iran can put pressure on Israel is to blockade and or strictly control traffic through the Strait of Hormuz. There we go. I'll bring out the old coloring pages. This here's the Strait of Hormuz. This little bit of land is where, I just double checked it. I want to say it's like 40 or 30% of where all of the world's oil flows through. Obviously, most of the oil is Iranian oil coming from here, coming from their ports and moving out, but also other countries in the region, Qatar, Bahrain, Kuwait, United Arab Emirates. All of these depend on the Straits of Hormuz as well to push their own oil through and push it out to wider markets. Saudi Arabia, to a lesser extent, because they have pipelines which cut through the country and send oil westward, so they don't need to rely on the Strait of Hormuz as much. But if, for example, Iran was able to put pressure on this oil traffic, not only would it cause economic disruptions across the world, it would also cause a lot of these countries to potentially put pressure on the United States or put pressure on Israel to say, hey, rein it back. Iran is fucking with our oil flows. That's fucking with our bottom line. Let's try and have some sort of negotiated settlement here. And you can use diplomatic back channels in order to achieve that outcome. I'd say that's a pretty low possibility, but it's definitely a card that Iran could play. On the extreme sense, they could even do a full blockade of the Strait of Hormuz. I really don't see that happening, mainly because that would hurt Iran more than anybody else if they actually ended up doing that. And something like that could also very quickly cause a huge escalation, which the United States would get involved in. So I don't see that as a possibility, but I do see some sort of disruption or control over the strait as a real possibility to try and force diplomatic back channels. So in a similar vein, what Iran could do here is they could activate and even more forcefully support the Houthis here in Yemen. And as we know this, because this has been happening for a while now, they have been using drones, rockets, whatever they can to attack traffic coming through this strait here. That's the Bab el-Mandab Strait, one of the narrow choke points in the world. And even if you don't succeed in completely shutting down traffic, which they haven't done, one thing that they have actually succeeded in doing is bringing up insurance premiums through the roof for maritime shipping insurance premiums. They've driven that up, which has ripple effects in the economy, which has ripple effects for countries in the wider field. And they can basically say, okay, you guys have had a little bit of a rest here, but now we really need you to kick it into high gear and really show what you're made of and really start disrupting traffic. And that, of course, can put pressure on other countries to create those kind of diplomatic back channels. But other than that, those are probably Iran's number one and number two ways of putting pressure on Israel and trying to bring some sort of negotiated settlement to what's happening. But if you've been paying attention, you'll know that Israel has been laying the groundwork for an attack like this for a long time. One thing they did when it looked like the Syrian civil war was finally over and everything was coming to a head here is they took a bunch of territory up here in the Golan Heights, including securing much of the high ground in and around this area. And what this has allowed Israel to do effectively is they're securing the highest points in the region, and this allows them to much better intercept drones coming in from potentially the Iranian side, and also keep tabs on their militias and disrupt shipments of weapons coming through the area. But another thing that they have done about 6 months ago is they took out a ton of SAM sites in Syria. And one thing that Bashar al-Assad had in spades was a lot of surface-to-air defenses. And while Syria was in a state of chaos, Israel basically came in and blew them all up. And that basically allowed them to have it basically allowed them to build that air quarter, which they are using right now to strike against Iran because they take out all these defenses here. People treat Iraq airspace as it's basically open space. It's basically just international airspace. Everyone flies over it with complete impunity. But anyway, by taking out these surface-to-air defenses here, this allows Israel to use its air force to strike very deep into Iran. So they've been building up to this for quite some time, and now we are finally seeing the fruits of that come to fruition. So where does this leave us? Right now, as I mentioned before, I think it leaves Iran in a very weak position with limited options of striking back. Israel can continue to put pressure on and can continue to strike targets in Iran, but they cannot achieve their stated goal, which is to completely shut down Iranian nuclear capabilities, shut down all of their nuclear facilities, because they don't have the means to do that. So we will see how things develop. We could actually reach an impasse here very quickly. And one of the things that I'm actually less worried about this, now that we've seen some of the first salvos play out in terms of some sort of World War III-like scenario, because if I were Russia or if I were China and I were looking at Iran and what they have displayed so far, I would be like, why would I support this country? This is a lost cause. I'm not going to gain anything out of giving these guys support right now. I really feel like Iran has showed that it's a paper tiger and it doesn't have the capabilities that we thought that it did. So, yeah, I don't see this spilling into some sort of broader world war where, in order to prop up Iran, you have China and Russia coming into its defense, which then, of course, draws the United States and other countries into it. But at the end of the day, I do think the thing to really look out for is what role is the United States going to play moving forward? Is the United States going to try and broker some sort of ceasefire or negotiated settlement? Is the United States going to directly intervene on the side of Israel and start attacking targets directly in Iran? Because if the Iranian government is able to weather the initial storm and keep things together, Israel is going to run out of options to actually force that change and diffuse the country unless we bring the United States into the equation. Again, Israel, in comparison to Iran, is a tiny population. Let's just double check here. I want to say it's like 40 million in Iran. Oh, Jesus, I was fucking wrong on that one. It's 90 million. So population of 90 million. And if I'm not mistaken, Israel is about 6 million. Or is it 9 million? Okay, 9 million. Almost 10 million. So, yeah, Iran has about 10 times the population of Israel. And there's no way that Israel could actually launch some sort of successful ground invasion of the country and end up toppling the regime via direct military force like that. Because, yeah, if Israel tried to actually invade, Iran can come out and say, AK-47s for everyone. And, yeah, there's going to be so many people that there's nothing that they could do. And their only hope really is to either force the population to overthrow the government or have the United States come in and bring their military might to bear. So I don't know what's going to happen. It's incredibly stressful. I've been, again, following politics all my life, and 2025 has, I would say it's been the most stressful time to follow politics of my entire life. Before that, it was COVID, but somehow they've managed to make COVID look like a cakewalk in comparison to what's happening now. So obviously I'm going to be following this very closely. But yeah, I really don't know what's going to happen. All that I do know, though, is that Xi Jinping will continue to sit back and think,
China will grow larger.
All right, guys, that is going to bring us to the end of our show. I hope that gave you a nice broad overview of what's happening in the Middle East right now, what to look for, and what kind of pressure points are going to potentially be hit in the future. Once again, thank you guys for joining me. This has been the Comrade, signing off for now. And until next time, you guys take care. Greetings, comrades, and I wanted to do a little bit of an addendum to the episode I recorded yesterday. I'm waking up now. That's why I just pretty much got up, don't have the suit on, and then I'm in the middle of my morning routine, which is usually reading the news, catching up on everything that happened with my coffee. And then when that's done, I go and work out. but having a little bit of a disruption in my precious morning routine where I wanted to talk about some of the things that happened over the last night since I recorded the episode. The big one here being Trump's truth that he tweeted, whatever the fuck you do on Truth Social, you truth it out. I don't know. So he truthed it out. It says, Iran should have signed the deal. I told them to sign. What a shame. What a waste of human life. Simply stated, Iran cannot have a nuclear weapon. I said it over and over again. Everyone should immediately evacuate Tehran. So this is a obviously insane statement, a crazy proclamation, and a lot of people initially were like, are they planning to drop a nuclear bomb on Tehran? Is that what they're saying right now? I think it's more said just to generate chaos and panic. I don't think the United States is going to drop a nuclear weapon on Tehran. I don't think, at least right now, as things stand, Israel is planning to drop a nuclear weapon on Tehran. If things in this war shifted, that would be a far likelier conversation. But I do think that this is mainly to generate panic and disorder. But I also think that this is laying the groundwork for a U.S. intervention. What that U.S. intervention is going to look like, is it going to be boots on the ground? Not at this time. I'm thinking it's going to be more like we are going to use our munitions to try and blow up fortified and fortified and subterranean Iranian nuclear facilities. We also had a deployment of one of the U.S. carrier groups, I believe it was the carrier group Nimitz, is being redeployed from the South China Sea to the Middle East area. So we can see that the United States it's building up its force capabilities in the region. We also had this, and shout out to Nathan from the Discord for posting this little tidbit of information. We have a large fleet of U.S. refuelers being redeployed towards the Middle East. This is another indication that we're probably going to see some sort of attack, or we're just laying the groundwork for that. But one thing that is definitely different from what I mentioned in the last episode, or what I mentioned in the last recording, is that now the likelihood of a U.S. strike has increased exponentially. And I'm wondering if part of this might be because they have seen Iran look incredibly weak in this initial foray. They have looked pretty much incapable of shooting down Israeli aircraft and defending their own assets. So there might be a calculus like, this is our time to try and put the last nail in the coffin for the Iranian regime. Our aircraft are probably going to be safe, so we can go in there and strike and not have a lot of risk involved in that. And I definitely think that's part of the calculation they're making right now. One thing that we have seen, though, over the last 16 hours or so, is that the Iranian attacks against Iran are becoming more effective. They seem to be either A, learning how to be more effective in those attacks, or B, the Israeli interceptors and defense systems are getting overwhelmed slowly but surely. There is a possibility that Iran could turn this thing around, but yeah, it's still looking not the best for them, especially if the United States is going to get involved in this. We've also seen Iran also put out some feelers saying, hey, let's do a ceasefire. Let's talk about a ceasefire. And also some of the Gulf states are also trying to get the U.S. back to the table, saying similar things. But there's really no incentive for the United States or Israel to come to the table right now. They're in a very dominant position. There's no reason for them to do a ceasefire because effectively they're in a position where they have all the force and they can do whatever they want. So that's where we stand now, a significant increase in the likelihood of direct U.S. intervention. While I think the major question out of this is going to be, can they effectively cripple Iran's nuclear program? And again, I find it very frustrating because we have Donald Trump coming out there saying, man, cannot get a nuclear weapon. And it's okay, dude, they don't have a nuclear weapon. And Tulsi Gabbard came out in March and basically said, yeah, Iran is not pursuing a nuclear weapon. And we talked about how a country like North Korea, with half the resources and a quarter of the time, was able to make a nuclear weapon. So it's really hard to take Israel and the United States seriously with this kind of saber rattling when they have been saying the same crap for about 2 decades now. But more so, I think, rather than disrupting Iranian nuclear capabilities, which is a big question mark of how, in the long term, effective that can be. It's more about trying to induce some sort of regime change. And what we talked about that in the last episode, that could definitely not go the way that everybody is thinking. And also, there's a question of how much can strategic bombing actually force a regime change. Historically, the evidence of this happening is extremely limited, is extremely small, and there might be the possibility of some sort of internal pressure if there is an active threat of a U.S. military ground invasion. But even then, for the United States to invade Iran, it would be a slog. It would be a real slog. We talked about how they have 90 million people. They've got a lot of natural resources. They have a military industrial complex. Plus, we're looking at the map of Iran here right now. It's an extremely mountainous and rugged area, which makes fighting and invading Iran a very difficult task. It would not be easy under the best of circumstances. So yeah, it looks like the United States is going to war. The peace candidate is declaring war on Iran potentially, and yeah, it's a shit show. It's a disaster, and at the end of the day, I think it's a very real possibility. Everybody loses here. Nobody comes out on top. So obviously, I, like many of you, will be watching the situation very closely as it develops. But that's all I got for you this morning. This has been the Comrade signing off for now, and until next time, you guys take care.